This is Dr. Stephen Kachikian from the Black Hills Regional Eye Institute, and today we have a video of an intraocular lens exchange. This is actually a pretty interesting case in that the patient had the original cataract surgery probably about 4 months ago, and as you can see from the video, the cornea has very significant scarring. And so before his original surgery, we did all our measurements, and all of them were very consistent from the standpoint of the measurements suggested that the patient needed about a 15 diopter intraocular lens. And so we placed a 15 diopter intraocular lens, and because of all the corneal scarring, the patient was actually a little bit hyperopic or farsighted. And after doing the other eye, they couldn't tolerate the difference between the two eyes because this eye was somewhat farsighted, secondary to his corneal scarring. And so what we need to do is remove this lens and place a stronger lens so that both eyes will be equal. We begin the case by making 2 side port incisions and injecting viscoelastic into the anterior chamber or the front part of the eye, and then we use that viscoelastic to gently get under the anterior edge of the capsular bag. And as you can see here, we gently inject the viscoelastic all the way into the periphery of the lens. And what we're doing now is we are very gently trying to dissect the lens capsule in the patient's natural tissue where the intraocular lens sits from the intraocular lens that's in there. Once we do that, we can remove this particular lens and place one that is about 3 diopters stronger. Okay, so what we've done up to this point is we have taken the viscoelastic, we've got it just under the anterior lens capsule and slightly out into the periphery. Okay, we don't want to overinflate the capsular bag because we don't want to break or tear it, but we want it to be sufficiently full. At this point, I am trying to reopen the patient's original incision. Okay, I was unsuccessful at reopening the original incision, and so we decided to place a second incision just adjacent to the original incision. And once that incision is made and slightly enlarged, then we will be able to continue dissecting the lens from the capsular bag that's in there, and then we'll place our new lens. One thing you will find is that it's not terribly difficult to free up the central portion of the lens, the big disc, but it becomes somewhat difficult to free up the haptics or the arm-like extensions on each side of the lens. And so what we'll do is we'll use our Sinskey hook here to see how free that lens is inside the capsular bag, and then we'll go back and use more viscoelastic and try and free up the lens all the way into the periphery. The periphery is beyond what is visible either through the microscope or in this video, but we know that those arms of the lens extend all the way out, and so we need to free up as far distally as possible. And this one is kind of almost free here, and then you'll see just the edge of the haptic kind of pop out and get freed up there. So this first arm is going to come forward as we gently kind of manipulate it, and we get it just kind of almost out of the capsular bag. We don't want to pull too much, but it does take a little bit of traction and a little bit of force to free up. There's that little terminal bulb of the haptic or the arm of the lens. So what we're going to do is we're going to get that freed up and moved anterior to the capsular bag into the anterior chamber, and then we're going to go to the other side and try and do the exact same thing. Okay, so once that arm has been removed, we'll move to the other side or the left side. We'll inject more viscoelastic, again, all the way into the periphery or the distal part of the capsular bag, trying to free up the other haptic or the other arm. And we use just kind of gentle manipulation and a little bit of traction to try and free free it, and what you'll see is it just kind of pops out of the corner there when it gets freed up. So it's stuck, not terribly stuck, but it's definitely healing in place, which is what you want, except when you want to remove it. And so we'll grab a little more viscoelastic, try and free up that terminal bulb of the haptic arm there, and see if we can't liberate this lens from the capsular bag and get it up into the anterior chamber. We place a little more viscoelastic, really trying to fill the equator of the capsule. You can't see it. I can't see it when I'm doing the surgery, but we know where it is and what we're looking for. So you'll kind of see that pop free here in just a second. There it is, just kind of freed itself up from the capsular bag, and now the entire lens has been freed up inside the patient's capsule, the original capsule. That lens is going to be moved anteriorly into the anterior chamber. And once the lens has moved anteriorly, we're going to place our new lens into the capsular bag. And the goal here is to place the new lens, the one that's about 3 diopters stronger, into the capsular bag. Once that's in place, that provides some protection to the other intraocular structures. It provides some stability and provides some protection so that we can then go about removing this original lens. So we place the new lens first, then we remove the original lens. One thing that we think about when we're doing something like this is how we're going to remove the original lens that we placed. You can refold it inside the eye and remove it that way. You can cut it into 2 or 3 pieces and remove it that way. And really, in my opinion, it depends on the material of the lens that's in there, because there's different types of material from different manufacturers. And so depending on the type of material, you can decide how you want to remove it, and it also depends on the diopters or the thickness of the lens. The lens that's in here now is a 15 diopter lens. And so that's not, I wouldn't say it's a thin lens, but it's on the thinner side. And so it should cut pretty easily, whereas if you had maybe a 23 or 24 diopter lens, that would be a much thicker lens. A stronger lens has to be thicker, and so it's not as easy to cut inside the eye. Alright, so here's our replacement lens going in. We put it in the main incision and gently inject it underneath the lens that we just removed from the capsular bag, so we just kind of nudge it out of the way. Get the second lens underneath that original lens and into the capsular bag. The lenses themselves are, to the naked eye, identical. The difference between them is the power or the strength of the lens that we're putting in. Almost like glasses lenses look identical, except they may have different prescriptions. So now that replacement lens is in position, you can see it's kind of gradually opening up, which is exactly what we want. Now we're going to cut that first lens. And so my technique is, in this case, I take a Sinskey hook and I hook the distal portion of the lens and I just cut right through the center. Okay, and that will give us 2 halves. Now the lens itself is 6 millimeters in diameter, so you need an opening that's at least 3 millimeters if you're going to take that out. The main incision that I made is a 2.4 millimeter incision, so I'm actually going to cut this lens into 3 or 4 pieces and take them out, because trying to take out a lens half that's 3 millimeters in diameter through a 2.4 millimeter incision stretches the wound too much and causes too much trauma inside the eye. So there we've got our lens now cut into 3 pieces, and those first 2 pieces there are probably about 1.5 millimeters to 2 millimeters in diameter. Okay, and so we'll grasp each piece to try and get a good purchase on that lens piece and just kind of pull it out of the eye. And there comes the first piece, and then we'll go after that second piece and attempt to grasp it. Now, sometimes it is hard to get a good purchase on these individual pieces, but these two seem to come out pretty easily. And then again, we'll go back with our Sinskey hook, and we will grasp the edge of the lens to provide some posterior support, and we'll push forward with these are MST lens cutting forceps or lens cutting scissors that we're using. And they're probably some of the more robust lens cutters that we have, except when you do get into the higher diopter lenses, or if it's an AMO lens, I find those very difficult to cut with this MST device, and so I wind up using a Van Ness scissor for those type of lenses. So now that lens has been completely removed through a 2.4 millimeter incision. Now we're going to go back in, we're going to use our IA or irrigation aspiration, and what we're going to do is we're going to remove all of that viscoelastic that we put in there. So all that visco that we put in to inflate the capsular bag, now it needs to be removed. And the viscoelastic, viscoelastic is a dispersive viscoelastic, which means it doesn't get removed that easily. The goal of a dispersive viscoelastic is so that it stays put inside the eye and it comes out in little pieces rather than in one big lump or blob. And so we need to spend a good amount of time making sure that we evacuate the eye of all the viscoelastic. You don't want to leave too much remaining in the eye, because then the patient will have a post-op pressure spike, and that will lead to some discomfort and some phone calls, and so we try and avoid those. And you can also still get a pretty good look at the amount of scarring that this patient has. And so remember, the lens that we're putting in here, we've chosen this power based on the patient's prescription post-operatively and the refractive versions formula, because if we were to have chosen the lens based on the IOL Master or LensStar or one of the machine generated suggested lens powers, we would have been off by about 2 to 3 diopters. So we have taken our prescription from the original lens placement, adjusted for that, and come up with a new lens power calculation. So now this new lens, it looks great. It's centering fairly well, and a lot of times the lens in the capsular bag has some memory from how the original lens was placed, and so you'll find that the secondary lens that we put in there will actually take the same position as the original lens, and that's just because the capsular bag is starting to heal into a certain configuration, and although we've dissected the original lens out, we may have not dissected or freed up the entire capsular bag, and so that replacement lens will often take the same position. You'll notice also that from this original surgery, there was almost 360-degree overlap of the optic, but probably not exactly 360-degree overlap of the optic with the capsulorhexis. And so what that means is that there was an area where the capsulorhexis, or the capsule, was fused to itself, and those areas are sometimes a little harder to free up or to liberate. But at about 4 months out in this patient, it wasn't terribly difficult to open up the capsule. Part of what helps with freeing up the lens from the lens capsule is doing a thorough job with cortical cleanup during the original surgery. And I do a fair amount of anterior and posterior capsular polishing when I do my cataract surgeries. And so I think that a lens itself, to being able to minimize any scarring and minimizing posterior capsular opacity and allowing the lens to be freed up in the future should you ever need to go back into the eye for any reason. Sometimes we'll find that we need to do this with toric lenses if the lens has shifted, although usually if that's the case, it happens within the first day or at the very least the first week after doing the surgery. And so those are always easy to liberate and manipulate. And so now we've got our new lens in place, and the next thing that we are going to do is we're going to work on sealing the incision. Right now I'm still trying to make sure that all the viscoelastic is completely out of the anterior chamber. I don't want to have any post-op pressure spikes. Then we will hydrate our wound, or wounds rather. There's 2 side port incisions and 1 main incision that we created. So we'll hydrate each wound, and we will work on making sure that the eye is watertight. We're also trying to get the lens as centered as possible. Remember, you can't see the distal or peripheral part of the capsular bag, and so it's hard to tell if those haptics or arms of this lens are fully extended. But this lens seems to be pretty well centered. I tend to be really meticulous about the final lens positioning and about making sure the wounds are sealed and watertight. And so I do spend a lot of time at the end of the case making sure the things are just as we want them. The next day you don't want to have any wound leaks or lens fragments or what have you. Now what we're going to do is we're going to place a suture, a 10 nylon suture, into that 2.4 millimeter incision. A lot of times we don't do that, but once the wound has been stretched with the lens cutters and then with large pieces of intraocular lens being removed from the eye, I think it's wise to suture the incision to make sure again that there are no leaks. And so we place a 10 nylon suture in the main incision, and we do a 3-1-1 tying technique. It probably adds a small amount of astigmatism postoperatively, but it's negligible because that suture comes out at approximately the 1-week visit. A lot of times, in addition to or instead of a suture, I will place a bandaged contact lens on the surface of the eye. Again, that contact lens stays in anywhere from 1 day to 1 week. It lends some stability to any of the incisions. It also gives the patient some more comfort, especially during the first night after surgery, allowing them to be comfortable in general without too much scratchiness or irritation. We gently clip off the ends of the suture and bury the knot. There you go. That knot's just buried there. I'm sorry, this is mostly off camera in this particular view. Now we're going to check to make sure everything's watertight and the eye is of good physiologic pressure. We'll get a couple of Weck cells and check all 3 incisions to make sure that there are no leaks. And then that's it. This was a very straightforward and successful intraocular lens exchange. The patient did very well. They were seeing 20/30 at their 1-week post-op, which is excellent considering the central corneal scarring. Thanks so much for watching this video. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me. Facebook, email, and Twitter, and Instagram, SteveKMD1. And we'll see you guys on the next video. Thanks.